Madam President, thanks very much. I was just listening to my colleague from Illinois talking about the need for us to have economic patriotism and to keep people from moving jobs offshore. I couldn't agree more. But the way to do it is to fix a broken tax code. And it's frustrating to me that we have the President of the United States, we have members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who have talked and talked and talked about the fact that we need to lower our tax rate and come up with a more competitive international tax system, and yet we do nothing about it. And instead we're going for these one-off political debates that we're going to have here on the floor this week, apparently, that unfortunately aren't going to make any difference to the workers in America who are seeing this erosion of their wages, of their benefits, and often of their jobs, because Washington is abdicating its responsibility. Washington is not doing what it has to do in order to meet the fiduciary responsibilities. We've talked a lot about that with these corporations. And our responsibility is to the people, to have the right tax system in place so that people can succeed, so that if they work hard, play by the rules, that the tax code is actually going to reward them, and that American companies can be competitive. And that's simply not what's happening now. We need to do a lot of other things too, like be sure we have a regulatory system that works, and be sure that we have an international trading system that works for the workers of America, and be sure we deal with our debt and deficit and other issues. But because the discussion of taxes is on the floor this week, I thought it would be helpful to just talk generally about where we are. We had a hearing today in the Finance Committee on this topic. We had experts in from kind of across the spectrum. And although they disagreed on some of the specifics about what we ought to do today, they all agreed with one thing, which is that our tax code is broken. It's not working. And by the way, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the nonpartisan group around here that advises us on the economic impact of things, has looked at the tax code, and they said that if you did deal with our high tax rates in this country and improve the corporate code, who benefits? It's the workers. And it's in terms of higher wages, better benefits, a job. This United States Congress has let the American people down. And it's time for us to deal with this issue and to deal with it in a way that can be nonpartisan. I mean, we have, again, both sides of the aisle agreeing that this thing is broken, and yet we can't seem to find that common ground to fix it. I would suggest that there is common ground out there if we just get off the politics and start working on, how do we actually help people to be able to get ahead. The issue that's come to all of our attention here in the Congress in the last few months the most is companies that are what they call inverting. And these inversions are when a company in the United States buys a company overseas, merges with it, and then becomes an overseas company. And often these companies that they're buying are smaller than the U.S. companies. And they become a foreign company because they're trying to get as far away from our tax code as they can. And they want to become domiciled. They want to have their headquarters be in a foreign country because that country's got a better tax code for a corporation to be able to succeed. And, again, there's been discussion on this floor about fiduciary responsibility recently. That people do, if you're in corporate America, have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. And so they're making these decisions. And Washington sits by the sidelines and lets it happen. And I think the answer is to reform the code. I think we know what we have to do. I think we got to get busy on it. Last week we saw another example of this. It was a Chicago drug company called AbbVie, and their bid to acquire a company called Shire, it looks like is going to go through, and their combined company apparently is going to move its tax headquarters to the UK, to England. This is hardly the first company to do this, and it won't be the last unless we change the code. In fact, according to the Congressional Research Service, 35 companies have inverted in the last 5 years alone. Now, look, I think the United States is still the best place to do business. Despite our bad tax code, we've got the most productive workforce, we've got the best infrastructure, we've got the rule of law, we've got some great research institutions, we've got a lot going for us, and we can compete in attracting business from around the world. So why are these companies going to England? Why are they going to the UK? It turns out they have a tax code that was designed for this century, this decade. Unlike here in America, where our international tax code was actually developed back in the 1960s. Things were a lot different then. Our tax code itself and the rates of taxation were established in 1986. That was 25 years ago. So international system back to the 60s, the rate we pay back to the 1986. 1986, Top Gun was at the top of the box office. People still communicated by telegraph. The Mets were World Series champions. Pete Rose was playing for my hometown team, the Cincinnati Reds. That's how long ago it was. And a lot's changed since then. The world has changed. The global economy is far more competitive. And it's very difficult for us in the United States of America to have a policy that's not affected by that global economy. And yet, well, every other one of our global competitors have reformed their tax code. We have not. They all have. By the way, after the reform, the United Kingdom has a 21% corporate tax rate, and they have a what's so-called territorial international tax system. That basically means that it taxes income in the UK if it's made in the UK, but otherwise it's taxed in the country where it's done. That means that they have a more competitive global tax system. And by the way, about 93% of the companies that American companies compete with have that kind of a more competitive international system. We've got the old style system. We also have a higher rate. So we have kind of a deadly combination, a high rate, 39% tax rate, which is now the highest among all the developed countries in the world. Not a number one you want to be, but we've also got this international system that's not competitive. So it's not a mystery why companies are leaving. When you look at the side by side, they're making a decision based on what's best for their shareholders. When you look at the changes in the tax rate since 1990s and 2000s, you can see by doing nothing the U.S. is falling further behind. Here's an interesting chart. This shows just in 2004 what the tax rates were and now what they are in 2014. So that's just 10 years ago. The U.S. is the same, 39%, and that 39% includes the federal rate plus the state rates. People say, well, the effective rate is less than that. Yeah, it's less than that because people do take advantage of some of the so-called tax preferences, but even so, our rate is higher than these other countries. Because we go from 39% to 39%, UK 30 to 21, Canada 34.4 to 26, and they're going even lower at the federal level. Netherlands 34.5 to 25%, Ireland 12.5, Switzerland 24 to 21, and look, they've gone to these territorial tax systems that we talked about. What's happened? Well, these are the companies that have left the United States of America to go to these countries. We mentioned AbbVie, that's the latest one last week. Medtronic, that was a couple weeks ago. But on and on. There's some companies in here from the state of Ohio. There's a company listed there from my home state of Ohio that chose to go incorporate somewhere else because of the tax code. And guess what? They're going to save about $160 million on their tax bill this year. That's a pretty darn good savings. And that's wrong. We've got to reform this tax code. In 1960, 17 of the world's largest 20 companies were in the U.S. headquartered. By 2010, only 6 were headquartered in the United States. In 2012 alone, our global 500 companies, the bigger companies, our share fell from 36% to 26%. Now, I'm not saying it's all due to taxes, but a lot of it is. If you talk to these companies, you find that out. I don't think, again, anyone disputes in the United States Senate or in the White House, for that matter, that tax reform was needed. I don't think so. And yet we aren't seeing it. Instead, again, we're hearing about these one-offs, these small things that seem politically popular but aren't going to make any difference in terms of truly bringing the jobs back and attracting more jobs, attracting companies that want to headquarter here in the United States of America. It's an admission that the United States is no longer the best place in the world to invest if you say you're going to require companies to do certain things so that they can't follow the tax code. It's a futile effort, I think, to try to keep companies here with these new requirements, because ultimately, if you do that and you make it even more disadvantageous to be an American company, so you have companies competing not just with one hand tied behind their back, but with 2 hands tied behind their back in the global economy, what will they do? Well, they'll probably sell because foreign companies can come in and buy them, and that's happening, and has happened. And if you're a beer drinker like I am, try to find an American beer these days. I mean, the largest share is probably Sam Adams with about 1.4% market share. The rest are all foreign-owned. Yuengling's up there too at about 1.4%. But all of them are. And companies have come in here, foreign companies, and bought these companies because they can pay a premium for them because their after-tax profits are greater because their tax code in those countries is more advantageous. Who does that hurt? It hurts American workers. I'm not saying they don't have facilities here, they do. But when you move the corporate headquarters out of the United States, the tax headquarters out of the United States, the history is, when you look at this, is that jobs follow, including the higher paid executive jobs, but also an intangible but really important thing to American communities is when you have a company there, and it's headquartered there, it's a U.S. company, they tend to invest in the community, don't they? So think of the nonprofits you're involved with, the charities that you help out on. Probably there's some company that helps out there too, and probably it's an American company. So, of course, we've got to keep up with the times, and we aren't doing that. And if we don't do that, we're going to see more and more companies leave our shores. I don't think these companies want to leave our shores. I think they're doing it because Washington is letting them down. Let's imagine for a second that the company did decide, again, not to do one of these inversions because we did some one-off things, including stuff being talked about here on the floor to say, you know, you ought to stay here. You ought to not take advantage, as I said, this Ohio company, $160 million a year benefit. Again, I think what's going to happen is you're going to see more and more companies become foreign companies. American workers and American jobs are going to be lost because you're going to see foreign companies come in and buy these U.S. companies. If we're truly patriots, economic patriots, we need real tax reform, and we need it as soon as possible. This can't, by the way, be just a Republican or Democrat priority. It needs to be an American priority. And it should be, because there does seem to be, as far as I can tell in talking to people, a consensus the code is broken. We have a pretty good sense of what we ought to do to try to fix it. One, I think we have a pretty good sense that we ought to reduce the rate, so the corporate rate ought to be reduced. I think it's got to get down to at least 25% for us to be competitive. Back in the 1980s, when we last did this, 1986, we purposely lowered the rate under Ronald Reagan to get it down to then 34%, so that it would be below the average of the other developed countries of the world. That's what we ought to do again, so at least 25%. Second, and we ought to do this, by the way, at the same time we eliminate some of these preferences, the deduction, the credits, the exclusions. And I know that's tough, and some people are going to say, well, gosh, I'm going to lose my special preference, or, you know, this is going to hurt my company. If they get a lower rate, one, they get a benefit, but second, it helps the whole economy to have a lower rate. Economists look at this all agree. This will generate economic growth and will result, by the way, in more revenues coming in through growth as well. So you broaden the base by getting rid of a lot of the preferences, take those savings to lower the rate, and then finally, you've got to do something about this international side. If you don't, we're not going to be able to be competitive. Even if you have a low tax rate, if you don't figure out a way to ensure we go to the system that's more like these other countries have all gone to. Again, about 93% of the companies that we compete with have this, what's called a territorial system, where you tax income where it's earned. If we don't do that, then I think we're going to end up making this problem worse, not better, by some of these proposals that say, let's just kick the can down the road and immediately do something to create a requirement on companies to do this or that. With regard to the anti-inversion rules, and there's talk about that now, let's not reform the tax code, let's just do something on inversions to make it harder to invert. We did do that back in 2004. We enacted anti-inversion rules that were supposed to stop companies from moving overseas. As you saw on the first chart, that didn't work. Companies did anyway. And I don't think it's going to work today. In fact, I think it could make the problem worse, again, because those companies would then be targets for foreign acquisitions. So if businesses are more valuable overseas than in the United States, and businesses can't move out of the U.S. themselves, I think a foreign corporation is going to step in and buy them. Bringing the Jobs Home Act is a great title, and that's legislation we're going to consider here on the floor tomorrow. And I think we ought to have a debate on it, so I'm going to vote to proceed to have that debate. It's a great title, but I don't think there's anything in legislation that's going to help to actually bring jobs back. I don't think anything in this legislation is going to address the fact that we have this high tax rate. I don't think anything in legislation is going to address the fact that we have a worldwide system that's way out of step with all of our competitors. It claims to remove deductions and tax credits that incentivize companies to move overseas. Unfortunately, that's not as easy as it sounds, because according to the Joint Committee on Tax, which is the group here that advises us, nonpartisan group, under present law, and I quote, there are no targeted tax credits or disallowance of deductions related to relocating business units inside or outside the United States. There aren't any. So, that's sort of tough to say that we're going to do something with regard to credits or disallowances of deductions when there are none that relate directly to that. And there have been claims to the contrary that the media, when they look at it, have routinely said that's just false or misleading. Finally, when it comes to proposed deductions for bringing jobs back to our shores, the proposal would likely pose some really serious administrative difficulties for an Internal Revenue Service that's already got plenty of problems. The legislation, as I read it, gives the IRS the authority to subjectively judge whether the IRS thinks that business deductions were made specifically for the purpose of bringing jobs to the United States or moving jobs overseas. Because there are no specific targeted tax credits or deductions for this, the IRS would have to somehow subjectively determine whether that was true or not. That's going to be tough because multinational businesses create and close businesses around the globe every day. Most times because it's the most economically efficient thing to do from a business perspective. So they start a company, they close a company, and move them around. Asking the IRS to determine whether those decisions were made specifically to move jobs to the U.S. or to move jobs overseas, I think is going to be impossible. That's why this legislation in the past has not gone anywhere. I do appreciate my colleagues' hard work in trying to come up with real legislation that will address the problem. And Senator Wyden, who's the chair of the Finance Committee, who's a Democrat, has been working on that, as have others. But this particular one's just not going to help. It's just not going to help. And that fact should serve as a stark reminder that the only way we're going to stop these so-called inversions, the only way we're going to stop people from saying, I'd rather be a foreign company than a U.S. company, is to make it more attractive to be here, to do what we should have done over the last couple of decades, and the rest of the world has. All of our competitors have, which is to reform our tax code so that it is good for American workers and good for American investment. And if we do that, I think America's best days are ahead of us. I really do. I mean, there are lots of things we need to do, as we talked about earlier, to make this country more competitive, to be sure that we are creating the best jobs and have the greatest opportunity here for everybody. But one thing we can do that will give the economy a shot in the arm right away is this comprehensive tax reform. When people have analyzed this from a macroeconomic basis, they say, if you did this, lowered the rate by broadening the base, go to this competitive international system, you would generate a lot more investment and a lot more business here in America. That would in turn generate more revenue. So it's growth revenues, which is exactly what we want to see. We want to see more jobs, and we want to see us being able to have the kind of growth and prosperity that we can help to get at this debt and deficit, which is a real problem. And going forward, it's a problem we're going to have to deal with, both because it affects the economy and because it affects what we're doing to future generations. As legislators, it's our job to fix this problem. That's what we were hired to do. And I know it's not easy. I know corporate tax reform is, a tough thing to do because you're taking away benefits from one company or another by lowering that rate. And by the way, when you do this, when you do lower that rate and get rid of some of these preferences to do so, guess what? Everybody has to pay taxes. So people talk about, well, isn't it unfair if some American companies under some years, because they use the tax code creatively, don't pay taxes? Well, if they can't be as creative because there aren't all these deductions and credits and exemptions to be able to use, they're going to have to pay taxes. Everyone will pay. It'll be a lower rate, and they'll be more competitive, and they won't be having this incentive to move offshore, but everybody's going to be paying taxes. And I think that's part of what we ought to be doing. To be able to compete and to succeed and to help American workers, it is time for us to make tax reform a reality. Let's not do things that might feel good politically and do some of these one-offs and half steps that in the end could inadvertently, but in the end could actually make it worse, not better. Because again, if you make it even more difficult to be an American company, you're just not going to have as many American companies because they're going to be bought by foreign companies that can pay more for them, can pay a premium. Let's instead get busy doing the things we were elected to do, which is to work across the aisle to come up with sensible tax reform, lowering that rate, competitive international system, and ensuring that we do create more opportunities for American workers to be able to compete and not just survive, but thrive in the global economy.